Welcome you, sir. I would like to invite Sri Amarnath Palit and Roshan Kennedy, sir, on the stage.
Writer par excellence, orator par excellence, bureaucrat par excellence. What more? We have none other than Sri Shashi Tharoor to talk to us about my life, my message. I think this day would be remembered in the history of Calicut Management Association for ages to come, because what we are going to record today will be there on the net for the next 100 years for young people to see and to get inspired. I welcome Mr. Amarnath to introduce the speaker.
Thank you. Dear Roshan, President of CMA, Mr. Mohandas, Chairman AMC, and respected Dr. Shashi Tharoor, good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, and also the dignitaries. The job assigned to me appeared to be simple, as it involves introducing Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who needs actually no introduction. The matter is slightly different here. I started enjoying to unearth facts and probably many details about Dr. Tharoor, an individual whose interests and accomplishments are so varied and so many, so I can't limit all that within the time allotted. Dr. Tharoor has already more than a few million followers on the Twitter. That shows how dynamic he is to influence thoughts of the youth of India and outside India. Incidentally, I am also a follower on him. Personally, I started hearing about him way back in early 70s when I worked in Calcutta. He was educated in Calcutta, and he started writing at a very young age. And his first published story appeared in Bharat Jyoti at an age around 10. His novel, Operation Bellows, was serialized in the Junior Statesman, another Calcutta publication, before his 11th birthday. This is all about the DNA. An author, peacekeeper, refugee worker, human activist, Minister of State, an MP. Dr. Tharoor was India's official candidate of India for Secretary General of UN in 2006. Dr. Tharoor is also the award-winning author of many books. He also writes for New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and the Times of India. I am sure all of you watched him on the TED TV, where he spoke about India. Inspiring is what the least I can say so. A speaker who captures the thoughts of the youth, a leader who leads the way, a human being who loves life and nature. Kerala probably is destined to have such a luminous person to distinguish the state as God's own country, a rare species with a special DNA who makes things happen. I leave the rest about him through his own words. Here is presenting him, Dr. Tharoor, on behalf of Calicut Management Association.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I suppose for the camera I should stay here. All right, fair enough. Thank you for that very generous introduction, Amarnath. And Roshan and Dr. Mohandas, good to see you all here. Apologies for keeping you waiting for a few minutes. I had to appear on the stage at the Calicut beach where Janashri is having its 4th anniversary. And there are about 25,000 people in the beach right there, listening to A.K. Antony and other leaders. In order to try and make it approximately on time, I left without speaking. But you can imagine it kills a politician to give up an audience like that. But I do want to thank Amarnath for his very generous introduction. It's very clear that he has done what people increasingly do these days, and that is look me up on the internet. Because, you know, they always find these nuggets of information, which they then share with the audience as if they have known me since I was 10 years old, and I'm very flattered that he did it. Sometimes it gets worse. I have a friend in New York who used to like introducing people, not only looking them up on the internet, but looking up assorted parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, you know, sins of omission and commission up and down the family tree. And he found on one occasion he was going to introduce a speaker whose uncle had been electrocuted at Sing Sing prison for kidnapping and armed robbery or something equally horrible. And having taken the trouble to look this up, he felt he had to use it. But these introductions are also very positive. So he thought for a minute and then said, our speaker had an uncle who occupied the chair of applied electricity at one of the nation's leading institutions. Which is just by way of saying that these introductions should be taken with a generous pinch of salt. The introducers will always find nice things to say about the people they introduce. But I must confess I was taken aback a bit to be asked to speak under the rubric, My Life, My Message, partly because I had stoutly resisted the autobiographical pretty much all through my life. And it doesn't help that my life has been particularly complicated in that I don't have a simple linear narrative to share with all of you. I was hearing with some envy of how Chris Gopalakrishnan, whom I've missed again, we have crossed paths at so many forums in the last few months, was telling you about Infosys and its founding and its growth. And so a wonderful story from a 10,000 rupee investment in a tiny flat to this multi-billion-dollar company today. Straightforward narrative. Mine is much more of a roller coaster. And what is more, it's a roller coaster on two different tracks, because when I was born in London, my parents happened to be there, as you can imagine. My father had gone to England at the end of the Second World War as a student and stayed on and was working for an Indian newspaper in London when I happened to emerge into the planet there. So when that was done, of course, as good Malayalis, they tried to cast a horoscope for me. And they sent the information of my birth to Kerala, and a horoscope was cast for me here also. And the result was that I had two horoscopes that did not match in any particular. I think this became a sign that I was destined to lead two lives. And I have pretty much done that all my life. So which life am I going to tell you about? I suppose the one that is more easily dispensed with, sadly, is my writing life, even though there were times when that loomed largest in my consciousness of who I felt I was. And perhaps I should talk about that before I talk about the professional life, which itself has gone through a few interesting changes in recent years. So it's going to be a very confusing lesson to the people who may actually want to listen to this or watch it one day on the YouTube channel that CMA is putting it up on, because the narrative is going to be a somewhat schizophrenic one. What happened to me? Well, I, as I said, was born in London. My parents moved back to India when I was very young. My father never quite saw himself as a migrant. He left in 1948 as an 18-year-old. But in those days, Malayalis used to go off to Bombay and Calcutta and Madras and so on in quest of jobs and opportunities. And the colonial legacy was still there, that one thought of London as another sort of city in the same political unit, the same empire, to go and work. So though we had become independent the previous year, when my father went off, he went off in much the same spirit that a Malayali would go to Delhi or Calcutta. And he never saw himself settling down in a foreign country. He worked there, studied and worked there 10 years. But at the first available opportunity to come back to India, he was the locally recruited London manager of the Statesman newspaper at a time when all the senior managers in India were Englishmen. And he had to wait for an Englishman to retire before he could come back. And that happened when the Bombay manager of the Statesman, Mr. J.B. Pluck, for some reason, I've never met the man, but I remember the name from my father's telling of it, retired, and my father applied for the job, was selected, and came to Bombay, and I was all of 2 or 2.5 years old. So we came to Bombay. My parents were both from villages in Kerala, in Calicut district. I've just come from one of them, actually, having gone there for a wedding. And they're first generation urbanites, and the first city they lived in was London, and Bombay was the second. So I grew up there initially, and then when my parents, my father got transferred to the Statesman headquarters in Calcutta as advertisement manager in charge of the advertisement department for the entire group. I moved to Calcutta and did my last 3 years of high school there. And those last 3 years of high school coincided with the onset of serious disruptions in the university system in Calcutta. The Naxalite violence had started, the left had come to power and then been thrown out of power. There was a lot of violence in the streets. The university was in chaos, Calcutta University. Once considered the greatest university in India, it was in chaos, and what had happened was that examinations were not taking place on time. If you took the examination, you had absolutely no guarantee that the results you got would actually be your own. It was that kind of place. So I then, on my own, went off to Delhi for college. So I have the slightly odd distinction of having been born outside India of Keralite parents, but never lived in Kerala. Grew up in Bombay, high school in Calcutta, college in Delhi, with therefore friends, classmates, and so on, all over the country. And in many ways, that upbringing shaped the pan-Indian view that I developed from my very young years, a view of the country as a whole, because in every place I was both at home and not at home. I was a Malayali in these non-Malayali cities. In every place what I had in common was Indianness. I had friends from all over the country. The playgrounds I played in, the people I interacted with, the influences I had, the media I was exposed to, all were therefore from a wide national background. And that is therefore the kind of vision that I, from a very young age, internalized as my vision of India. Then I got a scholarship and went off to the US to study, having discovered that the moment I got my scholarship, I was technically, once you converted the dollars into rupees, I was technically earning more than my father was to support a family of 5 in what Indians would have considered style. I realized that I had to finish my studies before my scholarship ran out. So I worked rather hard and rather fast, finished 3 degrees, a master's, an MALD, sort of like an MPhil, and a PhD in a sort of record time by short-circuiting a number of processes that I'm told it's no longer possible to short-circuit. So I ended up being the youngest doctorate from the prestigious Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And armed with a PhD, I entered the UN. Now that's where I'll pause the basics of the narrative, because that's when the sort of divergent paths of my 2 lives will have to be summarized. And I'll leave the professional part for a couple of minutes and talk instead about the writing part, which in many ways began earlier. Because when we came back to India, I rapidly developed bronchial asthma. I was a rather sickly child, severely asthmatic from a very young age. And the problem, it was partially perhaps the climatic adjustments, allergies that develop, these things happen. But the problem was that for a small child in those days, that was a rather tough predicament. I mean, medications were somewhat scattershot. Some of the very good preventive medications were yet to be invented. I've since benefited from them later. So you take these very strong things to be able to enable you to breathe. It was still very difficult to breathe. And I was very often confined to bed. Now, I was a fairly precocious child in that I began reading very young. My mother, who used to read aloud to me from the noddy books of Enid Blyton and so on, sometimes used to disarmingly confess that she read so badly that I became impatient to read them for myself. But be that as it may, I began to read and write very young. By 3 or 4, I was already reading quite fluently and devouring books at a rapid rate. Now remember, I was born in 1956, so in the very early 60s, there was simply no other distraction available in India. There was no television, no computers, no Nintendo games, and nothing else. Books were the principal escape for anybody with an imagination who was not able to go out and play. And as an asthmatic child, I frequently could not go out and play. So the result was that I ended up having to spend a fair bit of time in bed, struggling to breathe and therefore unable to sleep, often sitting up because if you lay down you could simply not breathe at all. And books were the one distraction that I had. So I read everything available to me. I was the oldest child in the family. I read everything available to me in my parents' bookshelves, which meant I read a lot of books that I was not old enough to understand, but I read nonetheless. I didn't have any older brothers or sisters, so there weren't their children's books I could borrow. If I was taken to a library, I had the inconvenient habit of finishing the borrowed book in the car on the way home, and by the time I got home, the book was gone. So in some ways my writing began out of sheer desperation. There was nothing else you could do that you could read, nothing in the house that you could read that you could understand. Books that you had borrowed finished too quickly. What do? You write. There was one other thing I did. I played a game called book cricket, which children of today's generation have never needed to play because they have so many other distractions. But many of my generation did, which is you took a big fat book like a dictionary or any other fat part. I think Winston Churchill's World War II history also came in quite handy. And you made up imaginary teams, and then you opened the pages of the book at random. And what would happen is you have your own code. So the even numbered pages, 2 was 2 runs, 4 was 4 runs, 6 was a 6, 8 was 1 run, and 0 was appeal for out. And once there was an appeal for out, you then open the odd numbered pages, and then 1 would be bowled, 3 would be caught, 5 would be stumped, 7 would be LBW, and 9 would be not out. So that way you would play, and it could keep you amused for hours on end if you were that crazy about cricket, which I was. So book cricket was one thing I did. I played innumerable matches between various teams of my own devising. But when I wasn't doing that, and even that could pall after a while, I would read or write. And as I said, reading was limited to me because of the factors I mentioned. And so I wrote for myself, and I wrote initially stories that were very derivative of the kinds of stories I was reading. So Enid Blyton would write all her stories of the 5 find-outers, or the Secret 7, or the Famous 5, all of these stories. And I invented a group of Indian kids called the 6 Solvers, and I wrote adventures for them, which were very reminiscent of Enid Blyton's style and plots and so on. I no longer know where these stories are. I'm sure they're not very good. But what was touching for me was that my father decided to take the scribblings of a scrawny, asthmatic child seriously. And he began getting these stories typed up so they could be shown to friends. I could even, just seeing your own writing typed up in those days was a very thrilling experience. And so from a very young age, I wrote these first stories when I was about 6 years old. My father's faith in my writing, I think, began to believe in myself as a writer. And I still believe that the best apprenticeship very often, and perhaps it's less true in other fields, but for a writer, is the self-apprenticeship, where you teach yourself to write by the simple fact of writing. And so I wrote, and I used to read these Biggles books. I don't know, again, it's a generational issue. There must be somebody here of my age who remembers a Biggles book, no? Well, they were hugely popular in the 60s. There was Captain W.E. Johns used to write these adventure stories of a fighter pilot called Biggles. Bigglesworth was his name. So I invented an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot called Reginald Bellows, who was fighting in World War II. So that was actually an attempt at writing a novel, though obviously it wasn't long enough to be one. My father would send these stories off. The first story that got published was a story called I think, Henry's Last Battle. I had probably read something too much about the American Civil War, and so I wrote this rather dramatic story about a father and a son on opposite sides of the American Civil War, and the father shooting the son, and it was quite dramatic. I was 10 years old or something. But the Bombay newspaper, the Bharat Jyoti, which was the Sunday edition of the Free Press Journal, published that story, and then suddenly the magic of seeing your name in print did it for me, because it can be very addictive. It's sort of like the first kiss, or for some people the first drink. You keep wanting to do it again, and seeing your name in print for the first time can be deeply addictive. And so I went on to write more and more, and these Bellows stories, the Bellows novel as it was, got serialized in the Junior Statesman magazine, with the first one appearing a week before my 11th birthday. And with this publication, I felt really that I had arrived. My school assembly, the principal talked about me as a writer and the stories, with my payments in those days, a princely sum of 50 rupees a piece, but over 6 installments, that was 300 rupees. I was able to buy my parents a record player with that money. I felt a tremendous sense of accomplishment, the sense that one could wield words to good effect, be good enough to be published, be read by others, and then be able to actually have the content of one's writing translate into something like a record player you could actually play. That was quite an extraordinary discovery. And so I continued writing right through my school and college days. I wrote stories. I see I'm driving out large numbers of the audience as the story gets more and more dull, and I apologize. I did warn the organizers that I'm probably the last person to give a speech about my life, because my life is not a particularly great example for anybody else. But those of you who are still remaining in the audience will hear more along these lines. So if you want to leave, this is a good time, as the others have done. Anyway, so I wrote these articles for various publications. In fact, at one point, I think by the time of the emergency, when the media was first censored and then there was a huge flowering of lots of publications, up to then, I think it was safe to say that I had probably been published in every single English language publication in India. My stories had appeared in Eve's Weekly and Femina. They had appeared in Youth Times and Junior Statesman. They had appeared in the Illustrated Weekly of India and even Chandamama. So I wrote indiscriminately. I used to come back home, finish my homework. Parents would always say, no one can think of writing as a profession. Writers don't make money. You have to do well at school, do your homework, study hard, and then you can write in your spare time. And that became my daily habit. So every single day, coming back from school, finishing the homework, and then writing. And that made me a fairly prolific writer. And of course, there is no better feedback than those of your own friends and family. And indeed, sometimes strangers coming up to you and saying, we read this and we didn't agree with you, or we did agree with you, or whatever. So that experience was, for me, a richly rewarding one, and I kept writing. I got the scholarship, as I mentioned to you, to go to the US. And when I went, obviously, my writing output had to dwindle a little bit. But oddly enough, in that year that I went abroad, thank you, I won a Young Journalist Award, which was competed for by Indian journalists under 30, and I had not yet turned 20. And I won it by having published just enough articles to qualify for the submissions required for the award. So it was the Rajika Kripalani Award. I believe the award is no longer given, or if it is, no one seems to know about it. But for a few years, it was the principal award given to young Indian journalists, and it was an honor to win that. But thanks to my parents, and my father, after all, worked for the wrong side of a newspaper. He worked on the managerial side and not the journalistic side, and he never believed that anybody who was any good was going to be a journalist. So he insisted that I should not think of writing as a profession. It was simply something that I should do for my own pleasure. And that's where the other narrative begins, because I left you all when I had gone off to finish that PhD. What could I do with myself? You know, when you're growing up in India, especially when you were growing up in those days, the days of the 1960s and early 70s, the one ambition that middle-class parents would instill on their children, of course, the first preference was to be a doctor or an engineer. There I had absolutely no interest. I was inconveniently good at passing examinations. So I always used to come first in science. But at the end of class 8, when we had to stream between science and humanities, I chose humanities. And my teachers were horrified and summoned my parents and said, why is this boy, he's first in science from class 1 onwards, why does he not want to do science? And my parents asked me, why don't you want to do it? I said, I hate the subject. I just know how to study, to write the exam, and the day after the exam I forget everything, because I'm not interested at all in what I'm studying. So you don't want me to spend the rest of my life doing that. And my father, to his immense credit, he was a wonderful, remarkable human being, particularly for his era, because his elder brother and my uncle and aunt had actually decreed from their children's childhood that one would be an engineer, one would be a doctor, and one would be an MBA. And believe me, the three of them were brought up to do exactly that, and they've all done that and done very well in their professions, but the parents had announced it when the children were not even 4 years old. My father, from the same, the younger brother of the same father there, said, no, let him do what he wants to do. So I did humanities, and so if you're not doing sciences, the ambition that most middle-class parents had for you in those days was to take the IAS examinations. In those days, the IFS was the more prestigious service. The top 6 or 7 or maximum 8 of the IAS would get into the IFS. And so that was my ambition. I was also extremely interested in the world. Don't ask me why. I was just always very curious. Indian newspapers were very short in those days. You would have 8-page newspapers and 10-page newspapers. But because my father worked for a newspaper, he would start the day with 4 or 5 newspapers, and then in the evening after work, he'd bring home another 5 or 6. So I would read 10 or 11 newspapers from all over the country every day. And I would devour international news. I always had a fascination. So at a fairly young age, I was pretty aware of the politics, the political leaders of most foreign countries that were reported in the Indian papers. And I was quite stimulated by it. So the idea of doing the foreign service appealed to me. But then, when I was finishing my studies, as I said, I got a scholarship. And I applied for the scholarship thinking, look, I might not get into the foreign service. Who knows whether my luck with examinations will persist. Or I might get in, but I might be assigned to some other part of the world. So if I'm getting a scholarship to go and see America, why shouldn't I? And I'd gone in that spirit. But it was also the time of the emergency. And Mrs. Gandhi's decision to suspend India's democratic, I had grown up taking for granted, was a profoundly disillusioning experience for anyone who was seriously contemplating government service. Because for me at that time, I had a roommate at Fletcher who was a journalist. Many of the people at Fletcher were mid-career. I was by far the youngest and one of the very few people who had come straight from studies. Everyone had worked a couple of years before coming to Fletcher. And this chap would come home with those wire service dispatches, news agency dispatches from India that were more detailed than the American normal papers would have printed. But I could read what was going on and was very, very sad. It was shame-making for me that so many things were being done in my country that when I was growing up I did not think was possible. The censorship of the press. One of my short stories was censored. It was a story called The Political Murder, which was accepted by Junior Statesman for publication. And it was going to be published a week or 2 weeks into the emergency. When the emergency was declared, they parked censors in all the offices. And the very idea of a political murder was a bit disconcerting to the censors, so they promptly spiked it. In fact, the story was very complicated because the political murder wasn't really political, but it didn't matter. The story was censored. And so there was censorship of the press for a while. There was, as you know, the arrests of many political leaders. I remember an Indian student in America who voiced his objections to what was happening in India. The Indian embassy refused to renew his passport, so he'd be forced to go back home. All of these very shame-making things were happening. And for some of the demolitions of slums at Turkman Gate, the forced sterilization campaigns, there were so many things happening during the emergency that was very difficult for somebody brought up to believe in Indian democracy, brought up to believe in Nehruvian values. Very difficult for us to swallow. So I decided at that point that I could not take the IAS, IFS exams. In those days, you could even write those exams in London. And I did a PhD partially as a way of delaying that decision. And then it so happened that I was able to stumble into the United Nations. Again, if you're not going to serve your own foreign service and you're very interested in world affairs, where do you turn to? You turn to the UN. But already in those days, I'm talking 1977, 78, Indians had become overrepresented in the UN body because as one of the first developing countries to become independent and with an educated, articulate group of civil servants, well-trained and so on, we found that Indians were flocking to the UN service from early on and flourishing there. So there weren't too many openings. In fact, there were no openings for Indians in the regular UN service. But the UN had these separate agencies. And one of them was an agency called the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Now, if you want to look at how coincidences make people's lives, which is why, as I said, mine is a very bad lecture to give a management association where you believe in planning everything. And I have planned nothing in my life. In fact, at no stage in my life have I known what I'd be doing 2 years down the road or where I'd be doing it. And yet somehow things have all worked out. But this is what happened. I was in my, at the end of my third year of college and before going off to America, I was very, very fond of theatre. I used to act through school and college. I won a number of Best Actor awards. In fact, I won every year in my school in Bombay. Then in college, I remember playing Antony to Meera Nair's Cleopatra at St. Stephen's College in 1974. So I'd done a lot of this. And in my last summer before going off to America, a theatre group in Calcutta put on a production of Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap, which is a thriller, and I played the detective who turns out to be the murderer. I've given the ending away, but you can't see the play anywhere in India anyway, so I suppose it's okay. So it was an exciting part. I was playing it, and there was a wonderful cast of people along with it. Now, it so happened that at that time, I wrote an article in The Statesman, an article about my feelings about Indian politics, Indian nation. It was called A Sense of Belonging. And a UN official, whom I'd never even heard of in my life, but who worked for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, was visiting a friend in Calcutta when he read this article at the breakfast table. And he said to this friend, "What an impressive article." And the friend said, "Would you like to meet the author?" And this UN official, his name is Virendra Dayal, said, "Yes, I'd like to meet the author." And the host said, "Very good, because we are acting in the same play together, and he is coming for the cast party tomorrow." So by the most astonishing coincidence, I go for a party of all the cast, the actors of this play. We celebrate this occasion, and what do we find? We find that a UN official there wants to meet me. So I step aside, I talk to him, we have a half-an-hour conversation. He said, "Have you ever thought of working for an organization like the UN?" I said, "As a matter of fact, yes." He said, "Keep in touch with me. If you ever come to New York, look me up." So while I was studying at Fletcher, whenever I went to New York, I would call on him. He was unbelievably gracious. I mean, when you think how arrogant senior people tend to be, maybe that is a lesson for senior managers in the CMA. Be kind to young people if you see any potential in them. Because he would always give me time. He would buy me a drink at the UN Delegates Lounge. He would talk to me about UN work. And anyway, at the end of the day, after meeting many times, when I finally was prepared to leave the security of academic studies and look for a job, he said, "Why don't you apply to UNHCR?" Which I did. Now, he was very correct about all of these things. He said, "Because I recommended you, I will not participate in the interview." And he got 3 other UN officials to interview me. But the interview went well, and a couple of weeks later, I found myself invited to UNHCR headquarters in Geneva for an interview. And I realized by the time I landed in Geneva, they had spent so much money on me, they had to hire me. So they hired me, and I initially came in on a 1-month contract with the assurance it would be a 1 year to follow. And I really thought, never lived in Europe, and here I'll be in the heart of Europe in Geneva. I'll have a chance to see a part of the world, maybe put some money in the bank, and then eventually go back to India. I had absolutely no desire to be anything other than somebody focused on India and in India. But the work was very interesting. I seemed to have a talent for it. I was appreciated what I was doing. And suddenly the 1 year kept stretching. I applied for and became head of the office in Singapore at the peak of the Vietnamese boat people crisis. I went there. And in addition to having gone out to head my own office at a very young age, in fact, I had to hide my age because I was 25 and most people assumed I was at least 10 years older, especially given that the name of the office was the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And Singapore being a Commonwealth country, many people assumed I was the High Commissioner. The High Commissioner was actually the head of the office in Geneva. But in Singapore protocol, I was treated as an equivalent of all the High Commissioners and ambassadors there. So there I was, and I had to, really use as far as possible my deepest voice and speak on telephone. And when I went for meetings, try and look very solemn, because otherwise they would have thought, who is this kid coming to be with us? But it was an amazing experience. As I said, apart from heading an office at a certain level and dealing with ambassadors and others 20, 25 years my senior, and having to deal with them as an equal and persuade them to do things, I also had the enormous satisfaction of helping people in grave distress. Refugees, after all, have lost everything. They've lost even not just their possessions, their material possessions, they've lost their homes, They've lost their friendships, their family members they've left behind. They've lost the familiar assumptions of their daily life. They've been wrenched out, often for political reasons, from a country and brought to another part of the world. And that experience, obviously, has put people in a sense of deprivation that is difficult for those of us who have not been forced out of our homelands to appreciate. Coupled with the fear of persecution, often horror stories to tell. And in Singapore, we had a lot of these Vietnamese refugees fleeing communist rule who were getting on little boats and coming out. And many of them had horror stories to tell. There were some amazing stories. I mean, I remember one judge married to a senator who fled in a boat, and amongst the proud possessions she had with her was a photograph of Rabindranath Tagore visiting her family in Hanoi in 1923. Or in Saigon in 1923. That photograph was amongst the few possessions she was able to leave Vietnam with. And I saw it and became friends with those people, that couple, until they passed away in America some years later. And they were also terribly moving stories. You know, there was one couple, for example, that left in a tiny little boat with a kind of cannibalized tractor engine. And the engine inevitably broke down, so they began drifting aimlessly on the South China Sea. They ran out of food, they ran out of drinking water. And they were literally subsisting on rainwater and hope, because that was all. But they had two small children with them, a baby and an infant. So what do? The parents slit their own fingers and got the babies to suck their blood in order to get some nourishment on the journey. And when they were rescued, as it happens by an American ship, they were so weak, they could not even stand. They had to be bodily lifted out of the boat and brought up into that ship. And then they were, my staff and I broke every rule in the book to get them off that ship, rush them to the refugee, to intensive care and hospital, and then eventually look after them in the refugee camp. And to be able to see that same family a few months later, healthy, well-fed, well-nourished, and embarking on new lives in the United States, that offered a kind of satisfaction that few jobs in the world, in any kind of profession, could have provided. I felt each day that I could put my head to the pillow at night, knowing that things I'd done had made a real difference to human beings' lives. And these were people I could see and touch, because Singapore didn't have the hundreds of thousands of refugees that, for example, there on the Cambodian border. There were at most a few thousand, sometimes only a few hundred, depending on my success in getting them resettled in other countries. And so the result was that I could actually relate to these people. I came up with some innovations. I got the refugees to elect their own leadership. So there were camp leaders who actually ran the internal administration of the camp. I got, for example, the UNHCR in those days had a dogma that it was not operational. We were supposed to have operational partners. But in Singapore, no operational partners are permitted. They wanted the UN to do it all themselves. So I had to recruit volunteers to do services that normally an NGO would have done, non-governmental organization would have done. And I used to go, for example, to Catholic churches and tell the priests there that I had a Jesuit education, and therefore, as a product of a Jesuit education, I had a right to call on them for assistance. And the priests would come, they would sometimes help contribute some charity, find some volunteers. It was an amazing, amazing time. I learned a lot, I was able to give a lot, but I was also able to learn a lot about how to operate in these environments. And I must say that there were some other interesting departures. For example, we had the first refugees from Aceh in Indonesia. I don't know how many of you are familiar. That's the tip of Sumatra, which was leading an armed rebellion against the Indonesian government. And they got onto a boat and they managed to slip past Singapore immigration and landed up in my office. And as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has a statute of office voted by the UN General Assembly, I felt I had the legal obligation to protect these people. And so I was in a bit of a standoff with the Singapore authorities who said, they have broken our immigration laws, we want to arrest them. And I said, they're in my office, you can't arrest them, I have UN protection. So then they said, at least we want to interview them, we want to find out how they got here. So I said, you can only interview them in the presence of one of my staff. And I was able to get away with that and protect these people and then very quietly get them out of the country. I remember having a meeting with the Swedish ambassador, not in his office or in mine, but walking on the street so that no one could eavesdrop, and working out a discreet arrangement whereby we could take these refugees out of my office into our car to the airport, that he would furnish them with the necessary papers to get them into asylum in Sweden. These were all initiatives that diffused potential crises. It would have been seriously embarrassing for the UN and for Singapore if the presence of these people had become public. Another problem was with the solidarity movement in Poland. When martial law was declared in Poland at the end of '81, a number of Polish sailors who were sympathetic to solidarity jumped ship and rushed to my office. They must have looked up the phone book, found the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and came. And I had to wake up people in Geneva saying, what do I do? But indeed, I was able to interview them, determine that some of them were genuinely refugees. They had a fear of persecution because of their beliefs. And I had to extend them protection and again put them up in cheap hotels in town where I couldn't put them in a Vietnamese refugee camp. They would have stuck out like sore thumbs. And so I had to do that and find creative solutions. On one occasion, I remember the Singaporeans, in retaliation to the first group of Polish refugees, banned shore leave for all Poles. So Poles could not get shore leave, they had to stay on board their ship. Well, one enterprising freedom seeker leapt from his ship and swam to the nearest ship he could find in the port, and there was an American destroyer. And of course, once he clambered on the destroyer, the Americans said, my God, he's a fighter against communism and for freedom, and therefore we should protect him. The Singaporeans said, no, we're going to arrest him, he's violating our port rules. The Americans said, stars and stripe attitude, over my dead body. So the Singaporeans were in the middle of a crisis here. And they called me and said, can you help? And so we worked out a formula where we got the fellow off the ship into the US consulate, where I interviewed him, determined he had refugee status, took him off into my custody, and the American ship was willing to stay. It was allowed to sail because the Singaporeans would not let that ship sail off with this Polish fellow on board. All these, there's so many anecdotes like this that I could tell, but this is not a time of anecdotes. It was just to convey to you that the opportunity to actually do things through your own imagination, your own energy, your own creative strength, that could actually change people's lives for the better. That is something that I believe every young man or woman should have the opportunity to do, and I was blessed to have it. I then wanted to continue working in Southeast Asia, but it so happened that one of the besetting sins in any worldwide organization is if you do well in the field, they want you back at headquarters. So I was summoned back to Geneva, where I had a couple of interesting stints, but not as interesting as I was in the field. I managed to then contest for an election as the head of the staff representatives of the UN staff. And I won that election. I became president of the UNHCR staff. A worldwide poll. Sadly, it was going to be the only worldwide poll I would win, but that's another story. And having won that election, I found myself in shall we say, at loggerheads with the man who then became High Commissioner for Refugees. I then had an assignment as the executive assistant to the Deputy High Commissioner. So I was chief assistant to the assistant chief of the organization at a time when the chief of the organization was neither happy with his deputy nor with me. So it wasn't a very agreeable couple of years, and that's when I decided I would leave. In the meantime, I was writing. And I was writing, again, evenings and weekends. You know, when I joined the UN, I said, what are the rules here? Am I allowed to write? And they said, no, you need permission. So I said, look, the fact is that people have hobbies, right? If somebody goes off and takes photographs on the weekend or collects butterflies or goes hiking, that's his hobby. My hobby is writing. So they said, in that case, you have to officially get permission. So from the very first year I joined the UN, I had a memorandum, which was on the files of the personnel office, granting me permission to write for publication, provided I didn't violate the staff rules. So I would always joke that as James Bond had a license to kill, I had a license to write. And I would carry a little disclaimer on my copyright page later of my book, saying that though the author is an official of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and later just of the United Nations, none of the opinions expressed by the characters in this book are to be construed as those of the author in his official capacity, which I think must be a unique sort of disclaimer for any author in the world. But anyway, so I was writing. I wasn't yet writing books. My PhD thesis had been published as a book, but otherwise, reasons of state. It was a study of Indian foreign policy making, as it happens, mainly under Mrs. Gandhi. And then I was writing articles in newspapers and so on. And suddenly it struck me, I was nearing 30. I was in Geneva. And I had this epiphany, thinking, what is it? What have I really accomplished? I've got this UN job. Yes, I've made some difference to people's lives, but for myself, what have I done? I have this writing talent, and I'm just writing all these articles in newspapers and magazines, which within a few days, if not the next day, will be thrown to the newspaper boy, the raddiwala to whom you sell your newspapers in our country. So I said I better do something more lasting, and I embarked on a novel. But I embarked on it without any idea whether I could pull it off. I was reading a translation of the Mahabharata, Pilal's transcreation, as he called it, of the Mahabharata. And I was struck by what a lively and interesting story our epic is. It's a story one had heard, of course, in slightly less stimulating ways, told by grandmothers and so on. But then to hear it in this way, read it in this book, made me think, my gosh, why not imagine the story being told in the 20th century? After all, the Mahabharata itself had been told for 800 years, from roughly 400 BC to 400 AD, told and retold and retold. Why did we stop retelling it? And so I said, if a contemporary Ved Vyas had to write about the great events of his time, what would it be? And so I imagined this cantankerous old politician in his dotage and in his anecdotage, called Ved Vyas, who was sitting and dictating his memoirs of 20th century India to a South Indian secretary called Ganapati, who comes, of course, to take his dictation, dragging his enormous trunk behind him. But this is a trunk containing his clothes, so you can see the profane uses of Indian divinity in the book. And this was the book that attempted to take the lessons of the Mahabharata, the characters, episodes, even philosophical digressions, and retell them as a satirical story of 20th century India from the British days to the present being 1987, 88. And as I wrote it, the story evolved. I had no structure, no plan. I'm just lucky that somehow I was able to pull off this conceit of grafting the characters from the epic onto my understanding of the history of the nationalist movement. And it became for me the novel into which I poured all my ideas about India, Indian politics, India's history, India's future directions. And when it was completed, I'm gratified to say that it found acceptance both by a British publisher, Viking Penguin, and then became one of the first books published by Penguin India, which had just set up shop in India the previous year. And the result is there for you to see. It's now in its 42nd edition in India. It's still in print. And I'm always delighted when a new generation of readers, whose parents must have first read the book when it came out, tell me that they're reading it now. It's a terrifically satisfying moment. And the book was very successful. When I came back to India on a holiday, I was lionized. I was getting offers to do various things. Apart from writing more books, the Times of India offered me a senior editor's job. And I thought, the hell with the UN. I've done my bit. I'm not happy with this new High Commissioner. Let me leave. So I decided to quit and come back and live in India. But we had embarked on the middle-class folly of buying a house. And until you've sold the house you bought, there's no way I could carry a Swiss mortgage on an Indian salary. So I said, let me come back, but let me first sell the house. And I put the house on the market. No one was buying it. In the meantime, and somewhat to my surprise, I got calls from other parts of the UN saying, we hear you want to leave UNHCR. Why don't you come to us? And I got calls from 3 or 4 different parts of the UN. And I was a bit surprised. I hadn't realized that people had noticed my existence outside my own UN organization. One of the calls was from the UN Peacekeeping team. There's a new Under-Secretary for Peacekeeping, Sir Marek Golding, and my old mentor, Virendra Dayal, was now Chef de Cabinet to Perez de Cuellar, Secretary General. And Viru was very unhappy about what was going on at UNHCR, his old organization. And when he heard that I wanted to leave, that for him was the last straw. He said, you can't leave the UN like this. And he told Marek Golding, why don't you meet him? So I still remember this very sort of otherworldly experience of going to London to launch my book, but being asked by the Under Secretary General for Special Political Affairs, which was a code name for peacekeeping, to meet him at his club in England. And so in this, rather oak-paneled club with sort of 19th century chairs, I sat down and was sort of interviewed by this very sophisticated Englishman, former ambassador and so on. And at the end of it all, he said, come and join me in New York. Even then I wasn't sure I wanted to do it, but I thought, look, in any case, I have to wait till the house is sold. And New York sounds like a place that, you know, if I work for the UN, I go back to India and say, I used to be in the UN, but I've never even seen the work of the UN in New York. I've never seen the inside of the Security Council. How will I feel? Let me go and see that. So I went off thinking it'll be for a few months. The house will be sold. I'll go back to India. Well, the few months extended. Again, my work was appreciated. I was asked to be secretary of a group that was reviewing all our peacekeeping operations at the end of the Cold War. New opportunities came by, new promotions came by, and I'm afraid even though the house was sold eventually, I moved my wife and kids over to New York rather than joining them in India, where I had parked them in the meantime. So as I said, no planning, a lot of fortuitous developments, a lot of accidents have characterized each path in my life. I found myself caught up in the huge drama of the United Nations at the end of the Cold War. Extraordinarily exciting place to be. Now, it had a similar experience at UNHCR, because when I joined the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, it was a very small organization. Everybody knew each other by their first names. It was not particularly well known or prominent. It was mainly set up to cater to the refugees fleeing Europe after the Second World War. But soon after I joined, the Vietnamese boat people crisis began to peak. We had Cambodian refugees. You had refugees in the Horn of Africa. In Latin America, where Somoza's dictatorship was collapsing, you had one refugee problem after another, and then the Soviets marched into Afghanistan. So suddenly UNHCR was being mentioned in 5 of the top 6 stories on BBC World Service News every day. That was the transformation. And when I joined peacekeeping, similarly, there were only 5 people, 5 civilian professionals and 3 military in the entire peacekeeping staff at New York headquarters. Soon after, at the time that I joined, there had only been 5 peacekeeping operations. The last one was set up in 1978. But the year I was joining, the excuse for bringing me on board was that Namibia was going to be independent, and we needed extra staff to help with that transition. So that was the first operation in 13 years of the UN. So I joined that team, and soon after I joined, suddenly there was a peacekeeping operation in Angola, in Georgia, then Yugoslavia erupted, Somalia happened. And I said, you know, you hire me, this is what happens. Your workload will dramatically increase. And peacekeeping again became a major world-recognized term and concept. All these headline stories all over the world about it. And I found myself privileged again to be amongst the small group of early originals, as it were, in the peacekeeping team, while this huge transformation in the UN's role was taking place. I was awarded Yugoslavia almost by accident, because Goulding never believed that the UN would take on Yugoslavia, because in those days peacekeeping was really meant to be about interposing lightly armed troops on a ceasefire line to prevent a war between 2 states from reoccurring, from erupting again. So the idea that we would actually go and deploy UN soldiers in the middle of an ongoing civil war in a UN member state was for him unthinkable. So he said, Shashi, you come along with me and you be the person handling Yugoslavia. And as you know, it grew. It grew from that first trip that I went with Goulding on. It grew into the largest peacekeeping operation. And I was the person handling it at UN headquarters in New York. So it was a huge experience. I'm anxious to not take too much time, because I did want to leave enough time for questions and answers. But that experience was in some ways very different from what I described to you in Singapore. Because in Singapore, I was making a visible, tangible difference. I was persuading immigration officers to take these refugees. I was negotiating with the Singapore government, with ambassadors. I was solving the problems of these refugees. So I could truthfully say that yesterday's refugees are not refugees anymore, and today's will not be refugees tomorrow. That was my slogan for the effectiveness of my work. But in peacekeeping, particularly during the Yugoslav Civil War, I found that I was working 18-hour days and taking great risks whenever I traveled to the area in the middle of a shooting war, without any assurance that because of my efforts, the blood would stop flowing. Indeed, the blood continued to flow. But there was a different kind of satisfaction, a feeling that you were leaving your smudgy thumbprints on the footnotes of the pages of history, which was nonetheless, in its own slightly perverse way, a rewarding experience. So I did all of that. And when the UN was finally pushed out of the Yugoslav fray by the decisive Western military intervention on one side of the conflict that defeated the Serbs, that period coincided with the end of the Secretary Generalship of Boutros Ghali, and Kofi Annan who had become my boss in succession to Goulding as Under Secretary General for Peacekeeping, and with whom I'd worked very closely, contested and won the post of Secretary General. There too, there is a happy accident. When Kofi took over as Under Secretary General for Peacekeeping, Goulding, having been moved to a different department, the Department of Political Affairs, sort of like the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry at the UN, he had gone to be the sort of UN Foreign Minister, expected me to go with him. But Kofi Annan not unreasonably pointed out that the only two people who knew anything about the largest operation were Goulding and myself. So he said, until somebody has been trained to take over from Shashi, let him continue for a few months. And in any case, he said to Goulding, you have somebody there in that job of Special Assistant to the Under Secretary General who will need to be transferred. So until he moves, let Shashi continue with me. And not only did I continue with Kofi, but we became so close professionally that when the few months were up and Goulding said, will you come now? I had to say, I'm sorry, I feel I'm needed here, I can't leave. And that decision made all the difference, because if I had gone to political affairs, it would have been a different UN career. By being with Kofi Annan, by playing a discreet behind-the-scenes role in his election, I was able to not only forge one of the more important professional relationships of my life, but also, I believe, get a very, very good sense of a first-class manager. You are all managers. You can understand that one of Kofi's great strengths was an innate ability to understand people, to understand the capacities of people, to develop trust in his staff and delegate authority to them. And so I exercised far more authority than I could have under a sort of micromanager like Goulding, who wanted to do everything himself and vet and approve everything himself. Kofi would delegate to me the authority to sign instructions and cables on his behalf, which in an organization like ours was a hugely important power. And I also knew that if I ever made a mistake, though he was confident I wouldn't, that he would back me up, that he would take the responsibility. That was a tremendously empowering sort of management technique, and I commend it to all of you. It became my own management technique, both by instinct and by watching how well he did it. But sometimes, of course, we can end up trusting the wrong people, and that too can be one of the weaknesses of this technique. I've discovered that myself later in my political life. But having done that, I then, when Kofi Annan became Secretary General, he asked me to come to his office. I became an executive assistant to the Secretary General, Director of Communications, and after some years working with him, helping shape his message and his role as Secretary General, accompanying him on many of his trips and meetings with world leaders, which was an education in itself, I then was sort of booted upstairs, physically downstairs, because his office is on the top floor, and I was kicked down from the 30th floor to the 10th, but booted upstairs bureaucratically to become head of the Department of Public Information. Initially an interim appointment, and then when I succeeded in motivating the staff there and transforming that place, I became Under Secretary General of the United Nations, in charge of communications and public information. That was as it turned out, my final assignment to the UN. I did that de facto from my interim appointment in 2001. I carried on till 2007, but I was actually given the rank of Under Secretary General only in 2002. And in that position, I suddenly found myself heading something very different from the humanitarian work and the peacekeeping work, which are both action-oriented, field-oriented work that one does in those jobs. I found myself in a much more bureaucratic function, where I had 880 staff in 77 offices around the world, where our budget was under daily attack from the Western countries who wanted us to trim our budget, where the programs we were doing were politically deeply controversial. And I had suddenly to inspire a demoralized staff, come up with new creative ideas and approaches, trim the number of offices we had for which we could not sustain financing, and at the same time persuade the governments who are our paymasters of the importance of supporting our continued work. It was a very, very different challenge from earlier challenges, and one that I took to with relish and gusto. I enjoyed that opportunity to be a senior professional manager for the first time, really, in my working life. In Singapore, I had a handful of staff. In other offices and functions, I was part of a larger bureaucracy. Here, heading my own department, running the equivalent of a ministry, as it were, was for me an extraordinarily educative and formative experience. At the end of it, as you know, I was invited to compete for the post of Secretary General. The offer came a bit late, largely because of our decision-making processes in our country. It was first floated to me in September of 2005 when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had come for the UN General Assembly and asked whether I would be interested. I said yes in principle. Unfortunately, the decision to go ahead with my candidacy only came in June of 2006, by which time, as we now know with hindsight, and with later information, by which time the Americans had already committed themselves to the South Korean candidate Ban Ki-moon. So there is always a question one can ask of how might things have been different had we been in a position to make this decision earlier and lobby the key countries earlier. Perhaps it would all have been very different. But in any case, India could not have been expected to give this priority because that was the time when we were negotiating the Indo-US nuclear deal at the time. And that was obviously a far, far more important priority for the government of India. And the truth also is that there was a certain amount of resistance within our system. You all know the famous crab story of our tendency to pull down people when they're rising, and we are our own worst enemies in these areas. So there was a certain amount of resistance, some of which, of course, reached the ears of the Prime Minister. And so I can't say that, that every little thing fell in place in the ideal way as we might have liked. But I did run a credible race at the last minute. My candidacy only lasted from the third week of June to the end of September, the 2nd of October, Gandhiji's birthday. I stepped down. But during that candidacy, I was running up against not only the man who eventually won, the foreign minister of South Korea, but a deputy prime minister, the serving president of a country, various other foreign ministers and deputy foreign ministers. And of the 7 candidates who formally entered the fray, and there was even a prince from Jordan, out of those 7 countries that formally entered the fray, candidates that entered the fray, I did come a respectable second, just 2 votes behind Mr. Ban in the first ballot. But I want to stress that I have no regrets. I think that one of the things the Bhagavad Gita teaches us is that there are some things that are worth doing because it is one's duty to do them, irrespective of the result. And in my case, I felt at that point when this choice was offered to me, that my entire working life at the UN had been a preparation for this function. That I had the unique background of having done humanitarian work, peacekeeping work, political work, and senior management, that I knew every aspect of the United Nations, therefore, all the main aspects inside out, and that I would be able to motivate and direct the UN Secretariat staff. But I had to realize that this is not like a job application where the person with the best resume gets picked. It is ultimately a deeply political decision. And you cannot fault governments for voting on the basis of political bilateral relationships and so on. And they did so. And I wish all success, as I did at that time, I wished all success to Mr. Ban, but I chose to leave. He was gracious enough to invite me to remain in the UN service. He offered me at the same rank as Under Secretary General the privilege of heading one of our peacekeeping operations in Africa, the Ethiopia-Eritrea mission. And I thought about it for about 24 hours, but I felt the operation itself was not a major challenge. And I also felt that having competed for the top job and lost, that it would be wrong of me to cast my shadow on the person who won, because if anything, I ever said anything at any point, people would think I was second-guessing him, or my presence would prompt people to say, this chap might have done this differently. Whatever. I thought the best thing to do was to leave the field altogether, and I did. I spent a couple of years, not very successfully, attempting to be a businessman, but that was only a cover. It was a way of having an excuse to keep visiting India and seeing how I would fit in back in this country. The business was with a friend based in Dubai who was interested in starting ventures in India. So with him and his company buying the tickets, I was coming to India every month for a year and a half. And because I had met all our national leaders as the senior Indian at the UN, for example, whenever a prime minister comes, I'm the person who has to meet with them and I spend time with them. Of course, in the case of Dr. Manmohan Singh, I had known him earlier. This kind of rootless Indian who has grown up in Bombay, Calcutta and Delhi and is actually from Kerala, I felt it important that I should represent my home state and rediscover my roots in my home state. And at the same time, the Congress party did not have the kind of strength in the assembly that could have won a Rajya Sabha seat for me or for anybody else at that time. There was only one seat coming up in that period, and that was obviously earmarked for our very senior leader, Vaila Ravi. So I said I'm willing to contest for the Lok Sabha, but I said I would like to contest from Thiruvananthapuram because it is the capital of the state. I want to speak for the state as a whole as well in Parliament and in Delhi. And what is more, there are bound to be more sort of educated people in the Trivandrum voters list who may have read my books, read about me, and I would not just be having to introduce myself from scratch to a rural audience. So that's why I asked for and was given the option of running from Thiruvananthapuram. And ironically, my calculations are wrong. All the educated upper middle class neighborhoods had the lowest possible turnout because of the simple accident of our timing of elections. You know that elections in 2009 were held on a Thursday. The previous Friday was Easter Friday, then there was Easter Saturday, Holy Sunday, Easter Monday. And then Tuesday was Vishu. So you basically had Wednesday as a working day, Thursday was a holiday for elections, Friday was a working day, and again you had a weekend. So any bureaucrat or government official or professional could just take 2 days leave, Wednesday and Friday, and get 10 days at a stretch, and they all took advantage of that and disappeared. So the result was the people I thought were my natural voters weren't there to vote. But the ordinary people and voters of Trivandrum, of the coastal belt, of the villages, they all turned up in large numbers to hear me. They heard my campaigning in halting, ungrammatical Palakkad Malayalam, picked up on holidays to the native village, and they voted for me, and I won the best majority that had been seen in 30 years. Except for the Indira Gandhi wave in 1980, no one had got such a large majority in Trivandrum. So I entered that. I found myself being made a minister very quickly, in a ministry that I obviously had some great interest in and some talent for. I'm proud to say that I was able to do a number of new things with the opportunities I was given. I was asked to be Minister for Africa and Latin America and the Middle East, and I worked very hard. I would have 17, 18 appointments a day. I would travel extensively. Because I was the only French-speaking minister we'd ever had, I was able to open doors with a number of our Francophone countries in Africa, particularly West Africa, and I was able to conduct meetings with visiting foreign ministers in the language they were most comfortable with. I was traveling when the tragic earthquake took place in Haiti, and I was able to divert my journey to go and become the first Indian minister to visit that country and pay tribute there to the victims, the UN victims and the Haitian victims, and extend some Indian assistance. I won't go on and on about this. There were a number of such initiatives that I was privileged to be able to undertake in my 11 months in office. But none of them, of course, made it to the media. There was very little reporting of the work I did. I'm privileged that those who worked with me, including some people who consider themselves senior to me in age and experience and were skeptical of me, but later told me what a privilege and a pleasure they felt in working with me, and how preparing a brief for me, they knew I would master the brief and even improve it in my work. All of that was very gratifying to hear, but none of that made the slightest difference. I had become the favorite target of a number of interests in our country, and particularly in our media. The political class, of course, had the understandable resentment that exists towards any mid-career entrant usurping the spoils that people have worked for all their lives. Many of our politicians have done nothing but politics since their student days. You can fully understand how they would feel about this fellow coming in after having had a lifetime somewhere else and suddenly getting an MP ticket and becoming a minister and so on. And there was an understandable reluctance to accept such a person. But all of that combined with the media's decision to make every single innocent remark of mine into an object of controversy made my position increasingly untenable. I might add in brackets that throughout my UN life, the UN used to ask me to speak to the media. Because in 29 years, I must have given thousands of interviews to every major media outlet in the world. I was regularly and frequently on CNN, on BBC World Service, even on Fox News, which is hostile to the UN. I was a UN official. They could actually speak to and argue with. And never once in my entire career had I ever been accused of saying the wrong thing, creating a controversy, putting a foot wrong. So how did it change so quickly in India? Beats me. I don't think I have changed. I don't think that anything I have said was in and of itself wrong, unless one wanted maliciously to misconstrue it. And I'm quite happy to address this in more detail in the Q&A. But be that as it may, after a number of such episodes and then a completely false accusation relating to my attempts to steer an IPL team to the state, I offered to resign and my resignation was accepted. So my brief career as a minister ended in less than 11 months in office. But I've returned, as I said, it was a bit of a roller coaster. I did not quit everything and depart. Many people apparently thought that I would resign the seat and push off and live abroad. But no, I came back to India determined to make a difference here. 25 years ago, I had given an interview in which I said, thank you. 25 years ago, I had given an interview in which I said, 23 years ago when the great Indian novel came out, that India matters to me and I would like to matter to India. I tried in those days to think of myself as mattering to India through my writing. But then when the opportunity arose to actually matter to India as somebody engaged in the political discourse of the country and engaged in the policy-making processes of our government, I did not hesitate for a minute. And I thought by coming back, it was a bit of a sacrifice. I gave up a number of personal and material comforts and opportunities in the Western world at a time when my name was, shall we say, commercially pretty viable. I gave all that up because I wanted to come back in a spirit of service. And I feel that those reasons have not changed, and the country is still the country that I want to matter to. So I decided to stick it out. I have kept low for about a year. I didn't give any interviews to anybody. Then I started giving interviews in Kerala and about Kerala. But otherwise, you know, from Obama to Osama, all the channels called me and I said, no, I'm not going to play your game. I don't want to give sound bites. But after about a year and a half of this self-imposed exile from the mass media, at a time when I was giving interviews to the BBC and CNN and Al Jazeera relatively infrequently, but I was doing that, I finally said, now, I'm sure the media, having suffered for having excluded me, will be willing to have me back. And though I still refuse to appear on Times Now, that particularly vile television channel in our country, I do appear on pretty much every other channel whenever requested. I don't do so whenever requested, sorry. I do so once in a while when requested. I do about, let me say, 5% of the requests I get, I say yes to, just to be able to contribute to the national conversation on issues where I believe I have something worth saying. Whether it's internet censorship, whether it's the findings in the Padmanabhaswamy Kshetram, whether it is our foreign policy issues, where I have something to contribute, I will do so. And I'm very pleased that my party has also been asking me to participate and speak for the Treasury benches on a number of major issues. I led the government side in the response to Jaswant Singh's attack on our foreign policy. I made a 1-hour speech without a note on our foreign policy at the request of the government. I participated speaking on the black money debate. I spoke most recently at Christmas time, just after Christmas, in the Lokpal debate. And I hope to be continuing to contribute to the public discourse on these issues. I had been asked to be the lead speaker on the FDI issue, when, of course, the government is then forced to shelve it for now. But if it comes back, I'm quite prepared to address that issue again, because it's an issue that I feel quite strongly about. So all of these things will give me an opportunity to contribute. Whether any ministerial office and so on is going to follow, I have no idea, and I have no expectations. I've tried my hand at that. The government knows how well I did or how well I didn't do. That's for them to judge. But as an elected member of parliament, my principal duties are to the voters who place their trust in me. And so I'm doing everything I can for Thiruvananthapuram. And just in December, I released, I believe as a first in any MP's performance in this country, I released a half-term report to my voters. I said, I've been MP for 2.5 years, and this is what I have done for you. And that report is available in English and Malayalam. You can go to www.tharoor.in. It's up there. There are still some copies available. If you want hard copies, you can ask my office and we'll get them to you. You can give your address to the people who have come with me, Sharad and Udayan, and they'll be very happy to send you copies. So just to show you the kinds of things. And now I'm very pleased to say that I believe others have begun following my example. I hope this becomes a widespread practice. And MPs, as part of their accountability to the electorate, will give the electorate a periodic report of what they've accomplished. To end then, I should circle back to my writing, because I left it with the great Indian novel. I tried to continue writing on evenings and weekends. I published another novel about the kinds of stories our society tells about itself through its popular cinema, a novel called Show Business, which was about Bollywood. It was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, which is the biggest honor that an Indian writer could get at that point. But I was just beginning my involvement with the Yugoslav operation. And so when publishers and agents called saying, what fabulous recognition, when is your next novel? I said, I can't write now, I'm dealing with Bosnia. And that was what happened. For several years I didn't write, then finally I wrote. At the end of the Yugoslav operation, I found the time to work on what became India from Midnight to the Millennium, my book for the 50th anniversary of India's independence. And then my columns continued, and some of them were put together in books like Bookless in Baghdad, the collection of literary essays, or The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, my most recent collection of short pieces about India in the 21st century. So all of this I have been doing when I can find the time. But my fiction has suffered. Even though my first books were all fiction, at least not counting my PhD thesis, let's say the 3 of my first 4 books were fiction. After that, I've only written one more novel, and that is a novel called Riot, which was written about Hindu-Muslim violence during the so-called Ram Janmabhoomi agitation. And I took the story of a real riot in Madhya Pradesh and reinvented it as a fictionalized novel about the collision of truth, of ideas of truth, of the ownership of history. And I'm very proud of that book. It's a book that I'm in many ways more proud of than its relatively modest success will suggest. And I encourage all of you who are interested in these issues to read that book. To this day, I get tremendous feedback from it. And just recently, a website run by a Muslim organization ran an extensive excerpt from the book in which a Muslim character is talking about the historical legacy of Islam in India. And I was only mildly amused that they took the writings of a Hindu writer, imagining a Muslim speaking of what his heritage in India is, and they, as Muslims, found it to be the best evocation they could find of that. So I'm very proud of that book, and I recommend it to many of you, Riot. But apart from that, I haven't written, and one of the reasons I haven't written fiction much is because of the nature of the life I've described to you. Non-fiction is interruptible. You know, if you're writing something, suddenly you've got to go off on a UN mission, go to another country, deal with another issue, write a major report, whatever. You can interrupt what you're writing and come back to it a few weeks later and still pick up the threads. But fiction requires not just time, which is scarce enough in my case, but a space inside your head to create an alternative universe, to populate it with characters, individuals, personalities, incidents, snatches of dialogue that are as real to you as those that you encounter in your actual daily life. And because that is a kind of magic spell you cast upon yourself, that does not survive interruption very well. That is very easily broken by the kind of interruption. So I've begun 2 or 3 novels and abandoned them because after some months of neglect, they could no longer live in my head. And I don't know, I'm not urging the voters to return me rapidly to the world of literature, but I think writing a novel may not be easily compatible with the political career that I find myself leading now, where one is constantly in demand, where there is no concept of a weekend. You spend Monday to Friday in Parliament in Delhi, Friday evening you get on a plane, come back, Saturday, Sunday in the constituency, early morning to late night visits, events, meet the public, etc. Monday morning back to Parliament, same thing continues. There is really no break. So in these circumstances, just being able to carve out time for the things you have to do, the speeches, the conferences, and so on, the column writing, is more than enough than I can manage, and therefore the idea of being able to pick up one of the 3 novel ideas that are bubbling in the back of my head and turn them into a book is at the moment somewhat remote. So what is my message? Gandhiji said famously that my life is my message. If you were to look at my life, I'm afraid you get a very confused message. You know, never know what you're doing, never know where you're doing it, seize the opportunities when they come, if they come. Let luck and circumstance and other people's judgment of you, whether it's a boss or voters, determine your choices in life. That is not a good prescription for the Calicut Management Association. I'm sure you believe in setting goals and planning for it, in working toward it, in ticking off the boxes to fulfill them. I've never done any of that, neither as a writer, nor as a UN official, nor today as a politician. However, one thing I can say is that when I wake up each morning, I look forward to the day ahead. And to me, the sense that I'm doing something that means something to me and means something to others, and that gives me the opportunities through my daily work to make a difference to the lives of other human beings, and even through my writing to leave an impact on the minds of other human beings. That is a great privilege, and it's one that I thank the Lord for every day. So I suppose my only message out of this confused and jumbled narrative has got to be, live the life you can. Don't let yourself down. Whatever you find yourself doing, do the best you can at it. Whether it's being a manager, whether it's being a writer, whether it's being a refugee official, whether it's being an advocate, whatever it is you're doing, just be the best you can be at it. No one can be better at being you than you, but you can certainly be pretty bad at it if you don't try hard enough, if you don't put in the effort, the discipline, the commitment, the self-awareness, and so on. You can let yourself down. So don't let yourself down. Do the best you can. I'm proud to say that in nothing that I have done have I ever turned in a second-class performance. I have always felt that I've done the very best I could. Maybe others could have done better, maybe others could have done differently, but I did what I could at the time I was doing it, and that I think is something that anybody can live by. And if as a result of all those happy accidents, I am where I am today, and you all want to listen to me, I suppose there is some message in that life. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
What more to say? I think next round of Parliament election, you should consider Calicut. And we'll all be there to support you. Question?
However, you're all welcome to come and campaign.
Thank you, Doctor. I think the session is open for the questions. I'll go to Dr. Jessina Merchant's question. She is a psychologist. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, the politician. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, the writer. Where do they cross paths, and how would you like to be referred to?
That's a very good question. Do they cross paths? I'm not entirely sure, because I see myself as a human being with a number of responses to the world I see around me, some of which I manifest in my writing. That is, my writing is a response to the world. But some of which I manifest in my work, whether for refugees, whether in peacekeeping at the UN, whether in politics today. My work is also a response to the world, but there are two different kinds of responses. I don't think that the writer's response, which is obviously one that is observational and analytic, can be the politician's response, which must be one of actually doing an action and providing a service. Perhaps the one place they may come together would be in a speech in Parliament, where some of the writerly talents, though I don't actually write out a speech, you're not supposed to read a text in Parliament, you're supposed to. So at the most you can have a few notes and then speak. But I will say that as far as my own instinct goes in answering your question, I would say that the writer is who I am almost from birth. I mean, as you know from the story I've told you. The politician is something I've become. And it is obviously circumscribed by a number of factors, including the willingness of the voters to tolerate me, the willingness of the party to tolerate me and keep giving me tickets, and so on. And of course, ultimately, my own sense that I'm making a worthwhile contribution. Right now, I do believe I'm making a worthwhile contribution, and I will intend, if I'm given a ticket, to contest again the next elections. But who knows whether a time may come where I feel that I should make way for younger people with more passion, or people who have not been disillusioned by the process, or people who have better skills for the kinds of compromises that are needed to be made in our politics. Who knows? If that time comes, I will probably be willing to accept the label of being a former minister or a former politician. Will I ever accept the label of being a former writer? No.
The next question is from M. Anil Kumar, a corporate trainer. On hindsight, do you have any regrets in having taken a headlong plunge into the politics of Indian politics?
Well, I've partly answered that through my various observations, and I would say no. I mean, it's been a bit of an Agni Pariksha. I've taken quite a bit of blows as well in the course of the experience, but At the same time, I genuinely believe that I have been able to make a contribution, and that having come in for good reasons, I should persist. So no, I would say I have no regrets. I have regrets about small petty things. When a journalist asks me, you know, Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class? I should have been, let's say, more conscious that using his phrase, which was a phrase I'd heard for 30 years in the West, a very common phrase that is not about people, but about the way the airlines treat people. The phrase cattle class is a reference to the way in which airlines herd people into seats. I should have realized that that is not a commonly used phrase in India, and it could be easily maliciously misinterpreted. Sadly, I didn't realize that, and I used the same words from the question in my answer, and the result, as you know, is that to this day, there are people around the country who believe that I think economy class travelers are cattle, which obviously I don't, since I was frequently one myself, and also because they're far better off than people in other modes of locomotion or walking on their own 2 feet, which are the majority of people in India. So no one could have misconstrued this in the Western world. In any other democracy, people would have understood this to be a light-hearted reference, and that too using a phrase already used in the question. But as you know, in Shakespeare said it many centuries ago, that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. And I realize that's one regret I have. I should have realized that the ear of the hearer has to be attuned differently to appreciate this kind of humor and so on. And as you've seen, I've become a lot less funny since then. Otherwise, no major regrets.
Thank you. Mr. Dinesh Verma, he is a business development manager for SB Global. There are 2 questions. One, which is the country that you like the most? And the second question is, in politics, what is promising for the future?
Well, I mean, the country is obviously India, or I wouldn't be here. I have had the luxurious position of being able to live pretty much anywhere in the world after a UN career, and I've chosen India because this is the country that matters most to me. I feel at home here. I can stand under the sun and feel whole in my own skin, which is something that I don't feel anywhere else. There's always a sense of foreignness somewhere else. But anywhere in India, and of course particularly in Kerala, I feel completely at home, and that's why I think this is the country that's the best for me. It's also, as I've written in India from Midnight to the Millennium, the country that has some of the most interesting challenges facing the world at the beginning of the 21st century. So the answers we find in India will, I believe, resonate throughout the world and make a real impact on the future history of the world. And so I want to be contributing in some way towards the finding of those answers. That is why I'm here, and I'm glad to be here. On the future of politics, it's too vast and vague a question. Does he mean my political future? All I can speak of is, I hope to be re-elected. Does he speak about the future of Indian politics as a whole? There I would say that our politics is a bit dysfunctional because I'm genuinely not a fan of the British parliamentary system. I'm a passionate Democrat. I want to see a democracy always prevail in our country. But as I've written in an article in Tehelka magazine, a cover story a few weeks ago, I believe that we need directly elected chief executives. You can call them president or governor or chief minister or whatever, at all levels. We need directly elected panchayat presidents, we need directly elected mayors, we need directly elected chief ministers and presidents, who would have a finite term of office, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, it doesn't matter, during which they can deliver results, instead of spending, as we have to do now, vast amounts of their time and energy in just staying in office and maintaining a parliamentary coalition in order to have a majority, because anytime you lose the majority in parliament, the government falls. I think we need a real separation between the 3 branches of government. Right now the judiciary is completely independent. But you should not be following this British perversion of electing a legislature in order to form the executive. The result is often legislators who are not qualified to legislate and who are only interested in being elected in order to form the executive. And if they don't form the executive, what do they do in parliament? Half the time they're disrupting and shouting and screaming because they don't see much purpose in the actual legislative process if they're not in government themselves. So this is a very, in my view, a dismaying choice that our leaders made. I would have loved to have seen a different system, particularly in the Indian reality. People say the American presidential system isn't working all that well. There is a paralysis between a Democratic president and a Republican Senate, the Republican House. But the fact is that we won't have that in India. Our problem is the opposite. We have too many parties. We have so many parties organized in so many identities, regional, religious, political, ideological, and so on, that actually assembling a monolithic majority to block an elected president would be very difficult. So in fact, an elected president would be able to get much of his legislative agenda done. But in a multiplicity of parties, an Indian president would be able to actually forge different coalitions on different issues depending on the interests of the various parties. So that system would work far better, in my view, in a multi-party country like ours, better than in a two-party country like America's. But having said that, the truth is, no one in India is going to want to change it. The politicians know the system they have, they like it. Bluntly, some will say they can manipulate it. Why would they agree to change it? So I think our politics is going to continue to be a parliamentary system. And I think we're going to have a large number of regional parties doing well. Judging by the recent public opinion polls, you've seen that there is a real risk that the next government, this government is a government of 7 parties. The next government may be a government of 20 parties, the way in which our voters are voting in the system. And that, I believe, will be a recipe for inefficiency in our system. And I am deeply disappointed that we have saddled ourselves with a system that gives so much importance to checks and balances over performance, accountability, and results.
Thank you. The next question is from Ashok Pudian, an architect. Suppose somebody see the first Malayali Prime Minister in you, how will you respond?
I think there are far more qualified and experienced Malayali politicians for that distinction. But there is no vacancy there, and I'm very proud to be a strong supporter. I'm very proud to be a strong supporter of Dr. Manmohan Singh, who's a remarkable individual and who has come to, back to office with a strong mandate from the voters of our country. So I think that's all I have to say on that question, right? Thank you.
Thank you. This is from Mr. Samir GP, entrepreneur living in China.
Oh.
How strong, he's that person. How strongly do you believe that new generation leaders such as you will emerge more in our politics and break through to put the crab mentality a thing of the past?
I think it's happening a little bit already. Right now there are a number of bright, young, dynamic, forward-looking people, many of whom have been educated or even worked abroad, who have been elected. It so happens that they're almost all the sons and daughters of politicians. So that's the only other side of the question, that they have this mentality, but they have had their opportunity because of their political pedigree. But I would say, so what? As long as the right attitudes and the right energy is brought to our politics by these young people, we shouldn't worry too much about who their parents are. In fact, I was struck by this. We always talk about dynasties in our politics, but I just inaugurated the 70th, I think it is, All India Ophthalmological Conference, a conference of ophthalmologists in Cochin 2 days ago. And the then elected new president of that All India Ophthalmological Society is a Malayali who is a very famous eye surgeon. And he has 2 children, a daughter and a son, and they are both eye surgeons. So it seems to me that it's somehow embedded in our DNA that we like to pass on our profession to our children. Once again, I'm going to have to be an exception because my sons are both living in New York. One is a journalist and the other is hoping to be a novelist. So neither of them is likely to want to come and assume any political legacy in India. But I'm just saying that somehow embedded into our DNA appears to be the sense that that one must give one's children an opportunity to take over what one has built. And in the case of politicians, why should that be any different? So there are young people there, and I think there'll be more such young people. As for people like me, coming from a completely different professional background, rather than a generational background, I'm not a young man. I'm 55 years old. I'm a month away from 56. India is the only country in the world where anybody would call me young or new generation. In fact, I won an NDTV award shortly before I resigned, ironically, for being the best new generation politician in India. And I thought, what new generation is this at my age? My gosh, the median age of our country is 27. 65% of our population is under 35. And our cabinet's average age is 65. So, I mean, how can one speak of really the new generation without taking into account these young people under 35 who really are our future? But I hope that they will take the risks. It's not an easy field to get into politics unless you get in young. But those who take that decision early and get in, they have tremendous opportunities. And I'm very impressed by some of the young people I've seen in politics. I can mention 2 Malayalis I've met who are I'm very impressed by. One is, in fact, 3 I'll mention, not to single out people. There are other very impressive politicians whom I've campaigned for in the elections, but there's young Haibi Eden, whom I just congratulated on his marriage, who has already been a national leader at the student level, who is not yet out of his 20s and has been elected as an MLA. There's Shafi Parambil, who went off, I think, from here to Calicut, but there was huge resistance to his coming as an outsider. And he has not only been elected, but has become a hugely popular MLA. And the third name I was going to mention is of another young political leader who, in our system, has overcome some pretty serious challenges to get the kind of attention that he has been able to get in our political space. And this is not something that I want to keep sort of pressing away and belaboring at, but he is the son of the Chief Minister, Chandi Uman. And I mention him because I was elected president of St. Stephen's College Students' Union when I was a Malayali student in 1974, and I believe I was the first Malayali elected. 34 years later, a Malayali got elected president of St. Stephen's College Union, a student body from all over the country, and that was young Chandi Uman. And seeing someone like this, still a student, so this is not somebody who's being elected to any bigger office. Seeing Malayalis who can hold their own at the national level, like Haibi and Chandi, shows me that people who have a national vision and at the same time are strongly rooted in their home state can truly become effective new generation leaders. And that's what I'd like to see much more of in the time to come.
Thank you, Doctor. And I have a last question. Management is about taking the stress. And the way that you have done your life so far, there has been a lot of stress probably within you. How is that you are able to manage that and then bring out the charm of smile on your face, please?
I don't know. Whenever people ask me such things, I say, what can I do? Choose your parents wisely. You know, some of these things are genetic. Some of these things are genetic. They come from within you. I've also sort of become that to some degree temperamentally. You know, as a kid, I'm sure I used to shout and scream like any kid. But from a fairly young age, I discovered the virtues of not always wearing your emotions on your sleeve, not always, shall we say, reacting adversely to either pressure or pleasure. In fact, the archetype of this was Kofi Annan. He was practically like a yogi. You know, you would never see him overreact, you never see him raise his voice, never see him lose his temper. He was capable of it. You could see a glint and flash in his eye that you knew he was angry. But my gosh, within, there was this extraordinary inner calm. And whereas I don't think I'm anywhere close to being a yogi or close to being a Kofi Annan, I've personally had a lot of respect for people who show that level of self-control and pleasantness. Because the world is a difficult enough place as it is. If you yourself, by your own reaction to events, behave in a way that upsets other people around you and that doesn't necessarily advance your ability to solve the problem you're dealing with, then what have you accomplished? So take stress, take it upon yourself, internalize it, but try and react to it as calmly and effectively as possible. It's not always possible. I do not want to pretend that the next crisis in my life I'm going to be calm. I'm just saying that one has to find the right sort of way. The truth is that you can never control other people's reaction to you, but you can control your own reaction to other people. And that's something that's always worth doing. Thanks very much.
There's one more question before this last question, and that is from me. Very personal, sir.
Uh-huh.
What is the best Malayali dish that you like?
Well, there's going to be some debate about how Malayali this is. These are both Palakkadan dishes that I grew up with as a child that I can't choose between. One is what we call Urlakayang Uperi, but it's a very special kind of Urlakayang Uperi because it uses something that is native to Palakkad, and that is called Ulli Samandhi. Do you all know Ulli Samandhi? So Ulli and Chovana Malaga and a little bit of salt, Nanna Arichita. Your mouth will become unpleasant to be near when you talk to people. So once you have roasted it to get the taste, you have Ulli Samandhi, which is best with idli and dosha. And idli and dosha, there is some debate about how really Malayali that is. That may have come to us from Tamil Nadu or Karnataka or whatever. But Urlakayang Uperi is you have to boil the potatoes in salt and haldi, and then you toss it in this Ulli Samandhi until the blessed thing turns practically black. And with all those carcinogens, then you eat it. It is the most delicious dish in the country.
Mr. Manohar, the publisher of Purna Publications, Indian politics is a game of compromises. Doesn't your role in politics conflict with your personal stamp of doing what you believe in and only what you believe in? What are the consequences?
That's an excellent question because I think it goes to the heart of a dilemma that I should have addressed in my remarks. When I was to the UN, I learned sort of my philosophy on this, which is that you have to be an idealist to work at an organization like the UN. You have to want to pursue some ideals. If you're motivated by something else, money, salary, security, go join a government or a bank or whatever. Don't be at a place like the UN. But you have to be willing to pursue your ideals within the framework of what is realistically possible. In an organization made up of member states, we have 192 countries, 193 now, who are your bosses, who delimit what you can do. You can only do what is politically possible, what they will allow you to do, and what they're willing to provide resources for. So I became, throughout my life, remember I joined the UN at the age of 22. Over 29 years of a career with the UN, I learned the art of pursuing ideals realistically. And that became essentially my driving force. I'm in politics because I have certain ideals. But if I'm foolish enough to say that every time somebody doesn't do things my way or disagrees with me, then I should quit, then I would never have a political career. My objective has got to be that I want to make a success of politics. I want to pursue my ideals. I want to stand up for certain values, principles, and so on. But I must pursue them within the framework of what is politically possible. That means that sometimes I will have to accept my government pursuing policies that I don't agree with, or my party taking positions that I don't agree with. But I will not be a hypocrite and speak in defense of things or support things that I don't agree with. I told my party the first day I became a politician that I will never support a hartal. Even if my party calls one, I will not be there with them. That is a fundamental principle. For me, it is a wrong technique. But if my party calls a hartal tomorrow, will I resign as an MP or refuse or denounce them? No. My silence will speak for itself. And it's possible that somebody may make an issue of my silence, but I will never support it because I feel that the party has a number of larger values, a number of larger goals that are worth pursuing, and I will disagree with my party on A or B, but I will support them from C to Z. That is entirely possible in politics. It needs to be, because otherwise in a parliamentary system, in any case where you need a party to be able to provide you a ticket, a support base, a party structure and so on to advance, if you just act as an individual in our parliamentary system, you'll never be able to make an impact and make a difference in the lives of people for which you need an entire party with you. So yes, I will preserve my ideals and principles. I will never betray my principles. I will not cheat or lie to my voters. I will not misuse my office. I will never overtly support anything I don't believe in. But I will still be loyal to the party that has given me this opportunity. And I will try, through my role in the party, to change minds and to make an impact. That is the best I can pledge you that I would do.
Thank you, Doctor. It has been a pleasure for me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I request Mr. Mohan Das to give the concluding remarks.
Before doing the honors, there are two honors to be done here. First of all, this Apollo Builtech, one of our sponsors, has come out with a Lucky D program. I know many of you have given your visiting cards. It's my pleasure to come out with a surprise gift. It's my pleasure to kindly request our honorable guest to find the lucky man or girl. PNB. Madam, Mr. Subramaniam, your friend. Senior Manager, Subramaniam, please do come.
Please come forward.
Give a round of applause. Thank you, Mr. Subramaniam. You are very lucky. See, today we have the National Award winner, Mr. Francis Kodangandath, with us. Francis, will you please come to the stage? Sir, he is one of the real great sons of Kerala. Yeah, there's so many art you can see around, and he is a National Award winner. We would like to honor him with a memento today. Please. Please. Thank you, Francis, and thank you, sir, for giving both the awards. President Roshan said, speaker par excellence, author par excellence, politicians par excellence. I will add strategists also par excellence. It was one of the thrilling speeches perhaps this hall has ever heard. I know CP sir and PK sir, they both have been clapping, even though they have been a little bit late. So the last almost 1 hour, 45 minutes, we have been thrilled. I think even though a lot of questions also came, I think all of you are happy with the answers also you got. And we can understand how a Malayali can grow up to this stature in life. Somebody was asking the question, sir, why not you become the Prime Minister of India? Unfortunately, we Malayali just lost. You could have been easily the Secretary General of UN. Lost by a wink, I would say. Sir was mentioning about strategic, some mistake in strategy, perhaps. Sir, you have been talking to us right from your childhood at the age of 5. And at the age of 6, you have become a writer. And your first article was published at the age of 10. Something amazing. Something, I'm a banker. I'm just unable to read even more than 2 papers a day. Sir, you are reading more than 10 newspapers. The number, and how you are managing your life. As really, we, Calicut, we really try to manage. We find it very difficult to manage our timing. But sir, you are really, really managing. Wonderful, wonderful. Today, in fact, President's son, Mr. Roshan's son, Kevin, was accompanying sir from Calicut. The boy was full of thrill and praise for sir, just telling that traveling with him really, really gave him a lot of inspiration. And all through a lot of meetings, not meeting, discussions, so many things over our phone were going on. But still, sir was telling, my aim is Calicut management meeting, and that is the first priority I am giving. Thank you, sir, very much. I take this opportunity to thank you, sir. You have spent only 20 minutes at the, a previous meeting, beach. And Sakir was after that. Sakir even told me that sir did not make the speech even there. So that's the love and affection, sir, that you are giving to this audience. Really, really, we are honored. Let us, why not give a standing applause and ovation to the great leader. May and this Malayali come great in life, they become the greatest personality in our country in a few days from ahead. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. As I was talking of our love and affection, I request Sri Shakir, past president, to kindly hand over a memento, which is again a work of the great artist Francis Kodangandath. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.